This presentation has to do with some considerations on the origins of apocalyptic literature and the genre more generally. And this comes largely from an article in the Encyclopedia of Apocalypticism, published by Bloomsbury and edited by John Collins. I think the editor, the publisher is Bloomsbury or T&T Clark. And Richard Clifford is an Old Testament scholar who actually has a different opinion about the origin of apocalyptic from that of, for instance, Stephen Cook, the fellow whose book we are reading. You may remember that Cook argues that the origin of apocalyptic in the Bible is deeply rooted in Israelite traditions themselves. Although Cook recognizes that the phenomenon of apocalyptic is widespread throughout the world, under certain conditions, largely having to do with a certain mindset. That is Cook's take on the origins of apocalyptic. For Clifford, this is different. Actually, Clifford argues that the roots of apocalyptic are to be found as far as the 3rd millennium BCE, and solidly in the neighborhood of the ancient Near East. Of course, we don't have ancient Israel existing in the 3rd millennium BCE, but what we have is cultures that emerged in Mesopotamia, in what today is the country of Iraq, Syria, and further east, in pre-Persian cultures. Clifford argues that this literature illustrates the rhetoric and the purpose of mature apocalyptic literature. So we are not talking about fully developed literature, but rather the precursor, what came before the literature actually emerged. And actually he suggests that the origin of apocalyptic can be seen in the comings and goings of gods and human governance. He argues in this article, and that is why I decided to make a presentation on it, that this is sort of a kind of ancient political theory. The political theory that we are more accustomed to, the stuff that we might have read in Voltaire and Rousseau, comes from the French, comes from the Enlightenment. Perhaps even earlier, some of you may be familiar with the writings of Machiavelli, or even further, we might be used to the writings of Plato in the Republic and Aristotle. So for us, generally, we're used to the Greek and the Roman and then later European stuff on politics and human governance. Clifford actually suggests that these ancient stories, these myths, are a form of political theory in the language and in the frames, the mental frameworks that they were accustomed to. Namely, the world is the stage where the gods and humans do their acting, are engaged in their relationship. Clifford also suggests then an early corpus of the literature as is demonstrated, for instance, by First Enoch, for Ezra, Second Baruch, and of course the two Apocalypse in the Bible, Daniel, and the book of Revelation. He introduces also the thought of Hermann Gunkel, the German scholar from the earlier part of the 20th century, who Clifford says is the first one to study this topic in a systematic way. And Gunkel is, among many other things, is actually well known for this proposal that what we find in Genesis 1 and Revelation 12 is really kind of the same material. Let me explain. You're saying, how is that possible? Genesis 1 and Revelation 12. In Genesis 1, we have creation. In Revelation 12, we have new creation. So Gunkel developed this little formula. Outside is the same as inside. Outside, this formula has been translated as creation equals new creation, but it doesn't quite equal that. What we have is outside is primeval time. The word Ur in German is cognate to the English word early. So primeval time, Zeit is German for time. Primeval time equals end time. So yes, what we have then is God creating at the beginning and recreating at the end of time. Moreover, Gunkel suggests that the battle myth that we are going to be talking about in a second actually entered Israel during the monarchic period. So, not during the exilic period. In a lot of literature about the formation of the Bible, it is suggested that a lot of these traditions were acquired by the Jews in exile in Mesopotamia first under the Babylonians, then later under the Persians. But Gunkel suggests that these enter already during the monarchic period. And the combat myth is actually important here because basically what we have in the apocalyptic literature is an expression of this ancient myth of the combat myth, namely that the origin of the world and to a certain extent history consists of a combat. In Mesopotamia, that is expressed by three stories that Clifford mentions: Lugal-E, Ansu, and the famous Enuma Elish. I asked my students in the first semester in Old Testament to read the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is the story of the creation of the world as a result of the defeat by the Babylonian god Marduk of primordial goddess Tiamat and her husband Kingu. Tiamat represents soul waters, who actually had rebelled against the gods, and Kingu represents fresh water. There is a rebellion, as I suggested, and none of the older gods are able to defeat Tiamat. As a matter of fact, all the gods are scared of her, they are afraid of her, and the only one who is able then to come forward and to present a challenge to Tiamat is Marduk. He defeats her, and then he creates the world with her carcass. In Canaan, the expression of the combat myth is found in the Baal cycle that comes from Ugarit on the coast of Syria. Of course, Baal is famous from the Bible itself, and actually the combat myth is very similar in Ugarit as that found in the Enuma Elish. The way that the world is created in the Baal cycle is by Baal defeating the monster Yam, which is Hebrew or Ugaritic for the sea. Similarly, Clifford suggests in the Bible, what we have is both in the creation story. You remember in Genesis 1, the creation happens as God is able to subdue the waters that are in chaos. The tohu vavohu, the primordial chaos. Gunkel sees also in the word that is used in Genesis 1 and in other places, Tehom, he sees that as a cognate of Tiamat, which is the goddess that Marduk defeats in Babylonia. Yahweh's victory over the sea is also seen, for instance, in Exodus 15, as well as in several Psalms. Okay, let's move on. Here, in the next considerations, Clifford actually bases these on the ancient Mesopotamian myth of Lugal-E that describes how Ninurta had been able to defeat a threat to the world. And but I don't want to focus on that. I actually want to focus on 5 points, 5 things that are observable from the story, and that Clifford himself actually takes from another Scandinavian scholar named Torkild Jacobsen. And these are the 5 things that Clifford comes up with. First of all, what we have in the stories of the combat myth is the relationship between an older god and a younger god that in reality represent a relationship between an older king and a younger king, in which the younger king, the younger one, provides support for the older one. So in the case of, for instance, Baal provides support for El, and vice versa. El, who is the older god, supports the younger god and his aspirations to dominion. In the story of Marduk in Enuma Elish, Marduk supports his father Anu, and in turn Anu gives support for Marduk's aspirations. In the Bible, the Ancient of Days supports the Son of Man in Daniel 7, and the one sitting on the throne supports the Lamb in Revelation 4 and 5. Second, the level of the victory is commensurate to the threat. Quoting from the article, from Clifford's article, quote, "The more profound the threat, the more profound the victory undoing it," close quote. Number 3, evil is portrayed as a natural force, but underneath what is implied is historical reference. This is important to keep in mind in view of what is happening in the Apocalyptic in the Bible, as well as in the Apocalyptic that we are considering in this class, that in reality, although these threats are described as monsters, what stand behind them is historical forces. Fourth, the judgment of the enemies follows the victory. And I want to focus here on the biblical stuff, Daniel 7, 8-12, Revelation 17-19. Finally, the victorious God reestablishes the original order. Once again, remember, Urtzeit gives way to Endzeit. There is a restoration of the order that was actually overturned